Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, sorry that this has been a little late coming. It's been a little chaotic on my end, just getting ball rolling for us, but I will try and get a little bit more prompt on these recordings and try and get them out to you a little bit faster. So, welcome for our first kind of recorded lecture for supply chain. And this should be kind of a broad scope overview. I'm going to try and keep these lectures a little shorter, just so that you don't have to try and watch an hour-long recording as well. But there will be a couple of informational updates as well on kind of your assignment. So, first and foremost, before I kind of jump into the lecture recording, just a couple general things and overviews. One, I want to make sure that you guys are clear on kind of that expectations and outlines of what I'm kind of looking for. So, first thing to kind of look at is your company proposal paper. Really, this is kind of what your general structure should kind of look like. It should be roughly kind of a report. So if you do cite sources, kind of go over that process. Make sure that it's an APA format. The goal here is that we're trying to you don't have to establish a large organization or anything of that nature. We're not going super in depth. You don't have to name any of these fictional people. We're just getting a rough estimate on what is typically considered a small to mid-size organization. Typically more on the small size. Mid-size is where you start to get over about 400 people, give or take. So we're, for the most part, kind of a small-scale organization. But you should start to kind of determine how many people are in your organization and what departments actually exist. So if you do have questions about kind of how to submit or what to kind of structure it, please let me know. I'm happy to go over it. You can send it to me for review before the due date. I'm happy to kind of look over it. But the goal here is to kind of have fun with kind of what you're what your company is going to be. It's just a fictional company. And you're going to place yourself wherever you kind of can, or where you think you want to be in kind of the supply chain link. So you can be the very beginning, where you are the raw goods distributor. You can be in the middle, where you are a third-party transport company, or you could be at the very tail end, where you're actually manufacturing and producing a specific good. So there's lots of different options that we can kind of look at. So, other things to kind of look at as well. Your first kind of task that I have assigned for you guys is, again, to start building out this fictional organization, this fictional kind of company, with some actual devices. I have provided a Google Cloud credit to all of you, so hopefully you did all redeem it. You don't have to use Google Cloud. If you have a machine that can do VMs and you want to build it all locally, feel free. That's a-okay. I just wanted to make sure that everyone had at least some way to kind of work on specific systems. One thing to remember, as I'm sure you guys are aware of with Google Cloud, just make sure that once you're done working on the system, that you turn it off, because if the systems are running passively, they will still eat through your money. So make sure you're doing that. Other thing right there is, if you do decide to make these devices forward-facing, where they are actually going to be public devices, please make sure that you give them a strong and secure password, because it's all fun and games until you get hacked by China or Russia. This happened in the past to some of my students, where they thought they were in a normal lab room and just used a normal password that they would use in the password, like Cisco 123 or password 01, and it got picked up by a bot, hacked very quickly, and they got a temporary ban from Google Cloud and had to respond and basically say sorry to Google because it violated the terms and services. So make sure that you use strong and secure passwords, and make sure that you remember them. So kind of talking briefly about the overall project and scope of what we're going to be working on here. I'll have the rest of kind of the quarter unlocked here, hopefully today. But the goal here is that we're going to be building out kind of this fictional company throughout the entire kind of quarter, and you'll kind of design and structure your overall business. The one thing that I want to kind of just really stress right now at the beginning is, especially because you're likely using Google Cloud, not all of your systems have to be able to talk to each other. So we're kind of building siloed machines, and they don't need to interoperate or communicate between each other. So on this kind of first lab that you're doing, or first task, I want you to kind of just build a database, an email server, and a web server. If you want to put them all in one box, that's fine. If you want to put them on all separate boxes, that's fine as well. Really, the purpose of a lot of these tasks is to basically just say, here's a goal. I don't care how you get to it, as long as you get to it. And the reason I'm doing that is to stress it very clearly that this is supposed to be kind of similar to a business-oriented task where here's the goal, figure out how to get to it. So there aren't any specific directions on how to build these things, just so that you're clear. So if you do feel that you get stuck or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to sit down and work with you and schedule time to kind of plug away, and I can give you recommendations of how you might want to restructure, or how you might want to set some things up. So hopefully that helps. But again, as these tasks progress, they do not need to intercommunicate with each other. Some might need a little bit. I might have a requirement, but you don't have to build a fully virtualized network for your fictional business on Google Cloud. So don't worry about that. So again, if there are questions, please feel free to let me know. Okay, so on to kind of the our kind of PowerPoints, and this is kind of chapter 1. So what is supply chain, and kind of what's the broad overview here? So supply chain is really it is a chain. It's all of our interconnected links to all the different facilities that we have, and the actual movement of goods from point A to point Z. So any of the supplies that are actually being shipped are, it's the cargo, it's the goods, materials, products. It's however we're making it from its raw material to the customer that's purchasing an actual device or item or finished product. So a supply chain can be very short. It doesn't have to be very long. It could be that the supply chain is, say, like a grocery store, and the grocery store is only for local goods or local farms. So the supply chain there is pretty short. There's a local farm. It boxes up its goods, carrots, ships those goods to the grocery store, and then the grocery store then provides those goods to the customers. And that's the length of the chain. And that's it. Now, it could be a lot more far-reaching and complex overall. So it could be that we're taking a raw material, like a tree, and it's then has to be chopped down, put on a truck, goes to a lumber mill. Lumber mill then cuts the tree into specific correct sizes. Those things then get shipped off to, say, like a paper company, Dunder Mifflin, and they turn that raw good into paper, which then they have to house at a warehouse, which then goes to another distribution point. So you get the idea. It can be very complex. It can be very small and short. It really just depends on how we want to kind of structure it. So, and it can get way more complex than that as well. So the more complex that it gets, though, the more potential security vulnerabilities that we have with a given organization. So we have to kind of figure out how we're going to secure the entirety of the supply chain from point A to point Z. And that's the really kind of important thing of kind of looking at it. So in order to do that, the first thing that you have to know is, well, you have to understand what the supply chain is and the elements of the supply chain as a whole. We also need to understand kind of what to expect, and then what's the correct function of each section of the supply chain link. And then we need to be able to identify when something is wrong and then how to fix the issue as well. So everything that we're doing here, and security as a whole, we're just taking what we hopefully already know in security and applying it to a little bit of a different setting, which is supply chain. So when we look at supply chain, the very first part is origin. Origin just means this is where the material is first introduced to the supply chain. This is the absolute starting point for the actual product itself. So at this point, we have to look at potential security risks that exist. So a lot of those, a lot of security risks do exist at that initial point of where that supply chain begins. So prior to it being introduced to the supply chain, there's a lot of risks might exist. So depending on our role, we might be responsible for that material prior to it being added to our link. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if I'm, say, like a third-party transportation organization, so I own a warehouse and I'm going to be just shipping or moving that product from one location to another, by the time it hands off to me, I still might be responsible for up until the point where that good comes into my possession. So if I have a contract with an organization like Apple, and they say, hey, you need to get our good to us by this date, and you need to go pick up the raw good from this location. Well, when I go down to pick up the raw good, that raw good, it's not even at my point right there or introduced to my link. I'm still responsible for the initial pickup and for the safe transfer of that good throughout that entire time. So essentially what it really boils down to is we have to know kind of what our requirements are, what our role is, and then what we're responsible for at each point in time. Because really what it boils down to is just one simple thing. If something bad happens to that good that I'm transporting or that I've purchased or anything like that, someone is always liable. They really are. So when looking at the supply chain, and we're looking at like manufacturing or suppliers as a whole, a lot of clients, so a lot of organizations typically will have their own plants or their own methods of transportation for the actual raw goods they can send off to be manufactured or assembled. And some will just ship to their customers so that they can directly utilize the material as well. So a lot of those manufacturing companies are the ones that deal with the raw goods themselves. So, and it's the reason that they typically do this is for just general cost effectiveness. So as long as they're a large enough organization, handling and dealing with the raw goods themselves is a little bit cheaper than on a larger scale than it is to hire it out to other organizations. So security at this point, so our role here has to be to secure everything from the initial point of acquiring the good, all the way from the time that we're ready to send out the manufactured good to a distribution center, or directly to the actual customer itself. So how does kind of supply chain look like, or what does it really look like? This is a very simplified frame of kind of what supply chain looks like. So we have the up at the top here, we have our raw material suppliers. So these are the raw goods. They'll send the raw goods down to a manufacturing plant. The manufacturing plant will then initially start to produce the device or item that it's going through into its initial secondary raw format. It'll send it likely to another manufacturing plant, which will then finish the specific product, which then goes to a distribution center or shipped to a distribution center, which is, say, like a warehouse or some other location. And then that gets sent off down to the actual, from that distribution center down to the retailers or the actual consumers. So, sorry, lots of notifications all going off on my phone, so if you can hear that, I'm sorry. So, really, when we're kind of looking at it across this scale, downstream supply chain is when goods are going from raw goods down to the retailers. Upstream supply chain is when things are being sent back from the customers up towards that secondary, up to the raw goods. So when we look at downstream, it's when raw goods are turned into a specific good that I want, such as like a cell phone. The upstream side of things typically is dealt with at, say, like the retailers, where they place an order for, say, more cell phones from Apple, and then those feed up to the raw goods, where Apple goes, okay, we need another 100,000 iPhones, we have to produce them, so that upstream market goes up to the raw goods supplier. So some other key terms that we should be aware of when we're dealing with the supply chain is we need to look at, say, handoffs. So a handoff is when a good is the point of transfer. It's when a good is handed from one location to another. So at each point where we're saying the raw goods material is sending that traffic to the distribution center, when that traffic is that good is handed to the distribution center, that is a handoff. So it's the passing of the product from one area to the other. This is probably where the most important aspect of security kind of comes into play, because typically whenever there is a handoff of a specific good, there also needs to be an exchange of data, or some form of, say, like paperwork. This gets us from anywhere from, say, like physical material, manifests, packing slips, general invoices, you name it, that's the general gist. So there has to be some tracking of the actual product itself as it's going from one place to another. So when we look at, say, like initial service provider and service providers, an initial service provider is or can be many different types of providers of a variety of different modes. So initially, though, your initial service provider is the first provider of how you're actually moving your raw good to the first manufacturing center. And so generally, we utilize ground transportation for most of these movements of raw goods to the first manufacturing center. Typically, not all the time, but typically, ground transportation is the first initial method. Service providers are also typically going to be considered, say, like ground transportation, typically utilizing, say, trucking is probably the most common. But the other option that we see with some initial service providers is also going to be looking at it from, say, like locomotive. So it might be a train. So rail systems might be another option. So trucking. Trucking is probably one of the biggest backbones of supply chain as a whole. There's others, obviously. We have, say, ships with airplane, railway systems, but trucking is probably one of the more common methods for some form of supply chain transportation. So trucking is used everywhere. It's used all the way across the globe, and it's only becoming more and more technologically advanced. If you look at, just like Tesla, they are starting to launch their first lines of actual trucks for freight. In fact, I think it was Walmart just recently purchased a large number of the Tesla's semis, and actually just upped their order by 5 times what they initially put in. So, yay! But also, what additional security risks are that going to pose? What other options? So we see that from a lot of different types of organizations where we now have fully electric cars, but now there's also going to be a lot of additional technology built into those semis. But then you also look at self-driving semis, which are coming into the market now as well. So a lot of those are kind of the items that we have to kind of be aware of when we're kind of looking at. And now we have to look at additional security aspects for a lot of those different systems. But getting back to kind of trucking and how it relates to kind of the overall in the supply chain, there's a lot of potential issues and security issues, but there's 2 primary methods of trucking in supply chain. The first is called line haul, and the other is hub and spoke. So line haul is just going from point A to point B. It's also known as long haul, where basically I load up the goods into a semi at point A, and it drives all the way directly to point Z. So there's no distribution center, there's no additional warehouses. It just goes directly from, say, like the manufacturing plant directly to the retailer. And there's no stopping or additional handoffs. So that's one option. The other, probably more common option that you'll see for, say, like Amazon or Walmart or other massive organizations are a hub and spoke model. Hub and spoke is typically where there's multiple different warehouse plants that exist, and they have a large number of different transfer trucks or cargo that will basically go from one location out to another, and it just tries to get specific cargo closer to its intended destination as it goes. So kind of think of it along the lines of, when I order something from Amazon, that product doesn't just immediately get shipped to Bellingham. Depending on where that good is. It might start in, say, California, and California might not have, because that's where it has the product in a warehouse, but California might not have a truck that's going to go all the way directly to Bellingham, but it can get that product closer, and so it moves it to, say, Portland. And then Portland, again, might not have something that goes all the way up to Bellingham, but it ships the good up to, say, Seattle, and then so on and so forth until the good makes it to our intended destination. So there's lots of different varieties that occurs as that good gets processed and gets sent from one area to another. So really, you can almost kind of think of it, if you want to think of it in networking perspective, it kind of works similar to a network, similar to TCP/IP, right? When I send traffic out across the internet, it doesn't just go directly to Google. It has to go across multiple different routers in order to actually get to its intended destination. Well, that's basically hub and spoke in terms of kind of traffic. So very, very similar. And that's the goal. So hopefully that makes sense overall. So again, line haul is also known as long haul. In terms of, if we think of like from a security standpoint between the two, which one is more secure, line haul or hub and spoke? Line haul is technically considered more secure because there's a lot fewer, typically there should be fewer handoff points than in a hub and spoke model. And the fewer handoffs that you have, the fewer potential ways that your good could get misplaced or damaged or stolen. So that's the kind of idea that we kind of look at. So on to other types of kind of shipping that we deal with. Another way besides just trucking is ocean shipping, like I mentioned. Ocean shipping is typically utilized for hauling a large amount of goods. Way more than we can do over rail or trucking. And that's the kind of the primary reason that we utilize that. So container ships, there's different ports and all across the globe. And so there's specific shipping lanes that will crisscross all across the entire ocean and between different continents that we utilize to actually ship a large amount of goods between those places. But there are still potential security risks that come with ocean shipping as well. Because there's such a large amount of cargo that is being shipped from one location over to the other, it's probably the most prominent issue is with smuggling of illegal goods. And so that's one of the things that we'll get into is kind of talking about the security precautions that we can take and the tools that we can utilize for kind of dealing with these types of systems. So other types of system or methods of transportation, I already mentioned it, but airlines are great as well. Commercial airlines are a pretty common way for shipping a lot of goods. You'd think that, our commercial airlines, like a Alaska flight going down to Arizona, is just going to be, if I purchase a ticket, it's just going to be me and other passengers and our goods or our, bags and stuff. Not always. More times than not, there are additional cargo that's stored on those flights, and that's how a lot of airlines make up money for a lot of those flights back and forth between those areas. Not always. I'm not saying that every single flight has additional cargo on it, but commercial flight also typically does. But then you also have the full US or UPS large cargo planes that can ship a huge amount of material back and forth between those. So we typically though only utilize airlines for, say, like speed is pretty much the major reason that we'll utilize airline over, say, like trucking or railways or over the ocean via shipping. And the reason for that is typically if we have perishable goods. So if there's goods that need to be transported from one point over to another, and there is a very large risk of it spoiling within a specific time frame, then that's where we might utilize airlines. So to put it in perspective, why do we do that? Not just that. Well, shipping via ocean can take, depending on where it's going from one area to the other, it could take honestly about 7 weeks or greater on average for getting the product loaded, getting it processed, moved from one area all the way over to the other. It's not a fast process for kind of going through that. So there's different types of security that we look at too. So PACs, those are passenger carriers, so commercial flights. Typically, again, like I mentioned, cargo is handled in a very similar fashion to, say, all cargo that we have on an actual passenger plane. So again, like I mentioned already, it's not just passenger flights that are actually sending stuff, but it's also cargo, potential, actual product goods that will go on those passenger airlines. So all cargo flights, which is what I was mentioning, like the UPS, like cargo plane, generally those don't fly as frequently. You might not see them, though if you may or may not have recalled watching the news, say like a year or two ago, I think it was, the news was showing, that UPS planes were flying, they were running low on UPS planes, specifically pilots, and they were adding more and more cargo freight, and they were launching every hour or so. They had a huge number of planes in the sky at any point in time, just shipping things as quickly as they could. So again, there's lots of additional items to kind of look at. I'm not going to talk too much longer on that. But the next thing that we kind of look at is third-party logistics providers, so 3PLs. So this is with 3PLs. Generally, these are contractors. They're, for the most part, they are distribution centers, so they own warehouses and they own their own shipping company, and they provide the resources to get a raw good from to a manufacturing center, or the product that was created at a manufacturing center to, say, the actual retailers themselves. So those are kind of our third-party logistics systems. That's pretty straightforward on that. So then we look into kind of the last little kind of bits, which is if we utilize a third-party logistics provider, typically what we'll also need to worry about is making sure that we have methods for tracking the actual goods themselves. And one of the most important items that you typically will always need when dealing with these systems is a POD, or proof of delivery. So this is a very important function of the supply chain, which is generally utilized to track the movement, location, and condition of our goods at any given time as it's moving from one location all the way over to the other. So these pods are typically utilized at each point in time that there is a handoff. So for each handoff, there's typically an inspection of the goods to ensure that the quality and condition of the good is still okay. There's additional kind of inspection to ensure that nothing has been, like I mentioned already, kind of said this, nothing's been damaged. But there's also additional items here that we might need to document these things based off of the legal stipulations of the country that we're currently shipping our good through. More times than not, again, the U.S. domestically ships a large amount of goods into its system. We're not really a manufacturer, so to say. So a lot of goods come from other parts of the world. So, and those shipping containers typically will go across to multiple different ports before they end up in, say, Port of Seattle or down in San Francisco. So we need to make sure that at any point in time that there's a handoff, that we can track the actual goods themselves. So the final thing to kind of bring up here is what I really like to show, which is a heat map. Now, this map is a little old; it's about 3 years out of date, but it still shows a rough idea. And so, what this heat map is a country risk rating, on the potential likelihood of a good getting stolen at any point in time, or damaged, specifically stolen though, in the supply chain process. Now, the reason, so we have to take this, however, with a little bit of a grain of salt, because this is all based off of reports of the actual good being stolen, or of goods actually being stolen. And so if a country doesn't report it very clearly, or if there are other aspects of why we're not, what dictates how they report it, then it might not, we might not be able to log that as easily. But a couple things to kind of note here is, as goods are being shipped between different locations and stuff, as they go to multiple different ports, typically, say, in South Africa or South America, it has a fairly high risk, but most of the risk is dealt with along the coastline, which is where the ports are. It's not uncommon, there are stories that essentially, as trucks leave the ports, they get hijacked, and more times than not, the people that are hijacking the trucks, it's a blind hijack. They don't know what they're actually getting. They're hoping that they're just going to score big. So sometimes they might get a shipment full of HD TVs. Other times they might get a container full of bananas. They don't know what they're trying to steal. So those are kind of types of things. In the U.S., it shows that we have a low risk rating of like a 1 to 2. It's actually a little bit higher depending on the location of the geographical location that you're at. We're actually sitting closer to like a 3 or 4, depending on specific locations across the coastline of the U.S. and also on the internal side as well. And the same thing goes for, say, Canada as well. Canada is showing at saying like a 2, give or take. But that's also going to be a little bit higher because they have different reporting standards based off of us. But why we have this heat map is to give you a rough gauge to go, okay, well, can I avoid shipping out of Russia? I hope so. Can I, if there is a raw good off on a different continent that I have to get over to me, what's the best way and what are the best methods for actually sending that good to those different locations? So we're going to talk a bit more about that stuff later. Hopefully this was helpful to kind of get us started. I'll try and produce a few more of these videos shortly and get more stuff posted. Again, if at any point in time you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I know this is not ideal because we're in COVID times, but you can shoot me an email, send me a message on Discord, whatever works best for you. All right. Thanks.